It was the kind of phone call no one is truly ever prepared for. Grace sat in a small apartment in Lagos when she received the news. Her father, the head of their family, had passed away suddenly from a heart attack. Grace's words seemed to freeze. She hadn't spoken to him in months, too busy with work, too caught up in her own life. But the weight of his loss was still crushing. Grace immediately called her brother, Victor. They hadn't always gotten along, but now was not the time for old grudges. She needed him. The news hit him hard too. Their father's death was a blow neither of them had expected, and they both flew home in Ibadan for the funeral. The house was quiet, too quiet. Their father had been a strong, commanding presence. Now, with his sudden death, there was a vacuum, and Grace and Victor could feel it. After the burial, the family gathered in the old living room, sitting in the same places they had for years. The elder relative spoke in hushed tones, exchanging condolences, but Grace's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't help but think of the will, the estate, their father's wealth, the land. Their father had been successful, but he had always kept the details of his wealth a mystery. Aunt Millie, their father's younger sister, arrived late, her presence like a shadow in the room. Millie had never been particularly close to Grace or Victor. She was sharp, no-nonsense woman, and there were always whispers about how she had helped their father build his fortune. But Grace had never really trusted her. When the lawyer, Mr. Olumide, arrived to read the will, everyone gathered in silence. He opened the large envelope and began to read aloud. Grace Olatunji and Victor Olatunji, Mr. Olumide said, are to receive equal shares of their father's estate. Grace sighed in relief. It was what they had expected. The house, the businesses, the land, they would divide it between themselves. But then Aunt Millie interrupted. "Wait," she said in a voice sharp. "There is something else." Everyone turned to look at her, confused. Millie reached into her bag and pulled out another paper. It was a second clause, one that had been added recently, according to Mr. Olumide. Grace felt a chill run through her face. This will also states that the full inheritance can only be divided if both Grace and Victor agreed on every decision related to the estate. Aunt Millie said, her eyes glinting with a hidden meaning. "Otherwise, I will be the sole inheritor." A stunned silence fell over the room. Grace felt her stomach twist. Their father had made an unexpected decision, but Grace knew what this meant. Aunt Millie, with a sharp mind and ruthless drive, would use this to her advantage. "What does that mean exactly?" Victor asked, in his voice tight. "It means that unless you two can agree on how to manage the estate, I control everything," Millie replied, her tone cold. "And I can make all the decisions." Victor's face turned pale. He had always been the more business-minded of the two, the one who was always thinking about profit, investment, and expansion. But Grace had always taken a different approach, one of compassion, of doing what was right for the family. She knew that agreeing with Victor on every decision would be impossible. This was a setup. "Why would Dad do this?" Grace muttered, looking at the will in disbelief. Millie smiled as if savoring the moment. Your father and I worked together for many years, Grace. He knew me better than he knew either of you. He knew I could handle this estate. Victor looked at Grace, eyes filled with frustration. We have to do something. We can't let her take everything. Grace nodded. She couldn't let Aunt Millie control their family's future, but she didn't know how to fight back. This was clear, and Aunt Millie was no fool. She had been planning this for years. Over the next few days, things grew tense. Grace and Victor tried to sit down and talk, but every decision seemed to spark a new argument. They couldn't even agree on how to distribute the land. Grace wanted to keep the family house in Ibadan, but Victor was determined to sell it and invest in new properties. Their differences were becoming more apparent every day. Grace couldn't understand why Victor cared so much about money. He was always chasing the next big deal, while she just wanted stability for the family. Their father's sudden death had forced them to confront years of unsaid words and unhealed wounds. But it wasn't just the two of them. Aunt Millie seemed to be watching their every move, a silent predator circling. She always found a way to insert herself into their conversations, offering advice, but Grace could see the gleam in her eyes. Millie had always been controlling, but now she had the power to pull the strings. One afternoon, Victor came to Grace with a proposition. "Let's just agree with her for now," he said. "We will get the estate, and then we'll figure out a way to outsmart her." Grace frowned. "Victor, you don't understand. She's not going to let us outsmart her. She's playing a long game." "I don't care," he snapped. "We will play our own game." Grace felt her heart sink. She didn't trust Victor anymore, not with this. But she also couldn't do it alone. The fight for the inheritance was threatening to tear them apart, and they were running out of options. As the days passed, secrets began to unravel. Grace discovered that their father's relationship with Millie had been more complicated than she had ever realized. There had been rumors of a love affair, of a bonding deeper than business, and it seemed that Millie had always had more control over their father than either Grace or Victor had known. One night, while going through some old family documents in the study, Grace found a letter that their father had written to Millie years ago. In it, he confessed how much he had relied on her, how she had been his partner in everything, not just in business. But the letter also contained a hint of regret. "I fear that I've allowed you control too much," their father had written. "I hope my children can be the balance I never had." Grace was stunned. The letter explained so much about their father's decision. He had wanted Millie to take control, but he had also wanted Grace and Victor to find a way to work together. The problem was, Grace and Victor could never see eye to eye. And now Aunt Millie was the one who held all the cards. The day of the final meeting arrived. Aunt Millie was sitting at the head of the table as usual, her sharp eyes never leaving Grace and Victor. Time to decide the future of the estate. Victor leaned in. "I want to sell the land," he said, his voice firm. "No," Grace replied immediately. "We can't. We have to keep something for the family. We owe it to Dad." A smile. Millie's lips curled into a smile. "You see?" she said, leaning back. "It's already happening. I will make the decision." Grace looked at her brother. She knew what was at stake, but she also knew what their father had hoped for, that they would find a common ground. She turned to Victor and took a deep breath. "We need to make this work," she said quietly, "for the family." He looked at Grace, and for the first time in a long time, He saw the woman who had always been his sister, his partner, not just someone who disagreed with him. "I agree," he said softly. "Let's make it work." Aunt Millie looked at them both, her eyes narrowing in frustration. She had underestimated them. For all her control, she couldn't break the bond between Grace and Victor. In the end, Grace and Victor found a way to split the estate, keeping the family house in Ibadan and finding a way to balance both their visions for the future. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And as for Aunt Millie, she may have won the battle, but she would never fully control the family again. The inheritance wasn't just about money, it was about family, legacy, and the bond that, despite all odds, managed to survive.